I am going to go to my next guest. We are joined. Let me bring him in first. I don't want to have his name up. Dr. David Hundeyin. David Hundeyin. He is an investigative journalist, author, filmmaker, founder of West Africa Weekly, and the 2023 James Curry Fellow at Cambridge University. David, welcome to the show, man. Thank you for joining me again. I really appreciate it. I always enjoy these talks, which is why I continuously invite you. Thank you for this.
Thank you for having me.
So, you brought up something that I didn't quite understand what was going on, and I'm glad you brought it up because you're giving context on it. And this came out yesterday. I'm sorry for using the BBC for this, but is what it is. Let's just go with it. West African countries to quit the International Criminal Court, and if I'm not mistaken, also the ICJ. These are the Sahel states, of course. Jesus, I'm sorry. There's stuff going on in the background that's kind of disassociating me. But this is Burkina Faso, Niger, and there's one more. What am I missing?
Niger.
No, I said Niger. It was Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali. Those were the three. So why are they doing this? What is the objective of backing out of the International Criminal Court, the ICJ? And what is the plan here around it?
Okay, so first of all, it's the ICC that they're exiting. Not the
I thought
ICJ.
they were backing out of the ICJ also. Okay, I'm sorry, I misunderstood that. The ICC.
Yeah, so it's the ICC, the so-called Rome Statutes, the International Criminal Courts. Now, I don't know how familiar you are with the ICC, but first of all, it's not an institution that has the entire world inside it. So,
kind of.
Some very notable countries. Yeah, the US is not an accessory to the ICC. Israel also is not.
Mm-hmm.
And essentially, if you look at the prosecution records, like people who have actually been held before the ICC, it's very difficult to not reach the conclusion that the only purpose of the ICC is to go after Africans, because the vast majority of those who have been prosecuted at the ICC have been Africans. In fact, I believe it was Senator Mitch McConnell. I'm not 100% sure about this, so please fact check me here. But sometime over the past year, a prominent U.S. senator, when commenting on the ICC's attempted prosecution of Israel for genocide, said, and I quote, that the ICC is not for prosecuting countries like Israel or the US. The ICC is for Myanmar and African countries. That's who the ICC is for. So countries like Israel, they have their own internal criminal processes, which apparently are stronger than those of the ICC. So in other words, countries like the US and Israel are basically to be allowed to investigate themselves, to try themselves and clear themselves, because they are effectively above the ICC, right? And if you also recall, Donald Trump has actually imposed sanctions against the ICC for daring to not even successfully prosecute Israel, because there hasn't even been a successful prosecution yet, just basically an indictment, or just basically stating that Israel is potentially indictable for the crime of genocide, right? Mm-hmm. Which is not the same thing as saying that Israel has committed genocide, but it's just the legal preamble that already has sparked such a furious response from Washington. Trump sanctioned the ICC to its eyeballs, to the point where the chief prosecutor, Karim Khan, if you recall, has been locked out of all his email addresses. Yep. Because under U.S. sanctions, no U.S. internet, no U.S. tech company is allowed to work with him. So he's been locked out of his email accounts. The ICC can no longer function properly because they've been locked out of their Microsoft Enterprise email accounts. He's also been locked out of his bank accounts. And this is especially crazy because this Karim Khan is a British citizen who lives in the UK. But because of U.S. sanctions, British banks have cut ties with him, right? So when you have an institution which very clearly the sort of imperial superstructure has no regard for and seems to think of it as a sort of lapdog whose job it is to go after people in the global south, then it makes sense for an emerging supranational institution like the Alliance of Sahelian States, which obviously sees sovereignty as its primary goal, to leave the ICC and to create its own alternative, which it is doing. We're not sure what the name of the new organization is, but we're hearing it's going to be called the Sahelian Criminal Courts. So the idea is basically that they are leaving this neo-colonial institution which exists to essentially be used as a sort of sword of Damocles hanging over the heads of African leaders, and they're creating their own sovereign institution that actually has teeth and that actually
Yeah.
does what it's supposed to do. Why that is also important, apart from the fact that the ICC has been used primarily to go after Africans and nobody else, why that is also important is that in the process of going after African leaders and prominent people who may or may not have done the things that they're accused of, um, ICC prosecution has also become a sort of political tool. So
Yes.
if you recall, in 2007, when there was severe post-election violence in Kenya, some of those who were identified as sort of key suspects in planning and funding the execution of this violence were taken before the ICC. One of them was a guy you might know called William Samoei Ruto, who is now the president of Kenya. He was taken
Really?
before the Yes, he was taken before the ICC. And the only reason he wasn't convicted, the only reason his case didn't end in a conviction, was that the seven key witnesses in his case all dropped dead one after the other. You can fact check this. This happened. All the witnesses started dropping dead one after the other, and the case basically fell apart because there were no witnesses because they were all dead. And this guy, from that sort of very sketchy background in 2007, ran in the 2022 Kenyan election. By that point, he had become the deputy president of Kenya. And by that point, he had also become very friendly with the US embassy in Kenya. I'm sure you get where I'm going with this.
Yeah, I
So
do.
basically, so basically, this prosecution, which wasn't progressed beyond that point, right? Because the case was basically thrown out, which he, then went to town crowing about it as though he was acquitted. He was not. But if you're not familiar with the case details, you think he was acquitted. Yeah, categorically was not. Um, so basically, partially with the influence of the U.S. government, potentially what we're looking at here is someone whose case, in addition to having witnesses drop dead, the case was also intentionally bungled, and he was able to come back to Kenya, to hero's welcome, and eventually become president. And as I'm sure you're very well aware of now, this is probably, I think, after Nigeria's president, is probably the most faithful U.S. vassal president on
Yeah.
the entire continent of Africa. This is someone who is allowing Kenyan police officers to be used as a proxy occupation force being paid by the U.S. government in Haiti. Right. This is someone who, under his leadership, Kenya has been designated as a major non-NATO ally. You know what that means? It's essentially a very big U.S. military base
Hmm.
in East Africa. Essentially, this is someone under whose leadership it's become clear that the um, the internal policy decisions that are taken are not necessarily taken with any sort of consideration of local context or anything. It's whatever the IMF prescribes. This is carried out faithfully to the letter. So the so-called Gen Z protests last year, which you recall in Kenya, where
Yes.
dozens of people died. What actually sparked of those protests? The finance bill, right? It was basically a tax bill that was, to all intents and purposes, dictated directly from the IMF. And if you read, this document is available online, by the way, it's on the IMF website. If you read, this was January 2024, a full 6 months before the protests, before the riots. It states in this document, this country document for Kenya, that these proposals will likely lead to social unrest. Like it states that in black and white. And then the recommended response is push through the policy anyway. So in other words, we know that people are going to hit the streets. We know that people are potentially going to die, but it doesn't matter. Push it through anyway. And that's exactly what he did. And in the process of pushing it through, you know, those incredible scenes of police brutality and violence that you saw, what you also may not know is that a lot of the hardware that was being used to repress Kenyans in the streets, so those infantry fighting vehicles with water cannons, that was all American gear, right? Some of those cops, like, all dressed up like GI Joes, they were walking around with US flag patches on their uniforms because that equipment and gear was supplied by the US government, right? So basically, military-grade tactical gear was supplied to the Kenyan government to use on civilian protesters under the age of 25, right? So that's what having the ICC as this huge hammer dangling over the head of African leaders can contribute to. It can contribute to a situation where a head of state or a president can be used as a puppet, can be essentially blackmailed using what he may or may not have done as a bargaining chip with regard to ICC prosecution. So I think it's definitely a step in the right direction for the Sahelian Alliance to pull out of the entire thing. I'm not entirely sure that a Sahelian court is, I mean, it's a good start. I'm not sure that's sufficient for the purposes of handling any potential, what's the word I'm looking for? Transnational criminal cases, especially where those relate to countries not necessarily within the AES. I think ultimately the solution will still lie at a Pan-African level. I think there needs to be an African criminal court, which, by the way, is something that is supposed to, according to the AU's charter, is something that is supposed to exist, but still doesn't exist in any meaningful sense yet. So the AES is definitely heading in the right direction, but at the end of the day, it's just 3 countries in a 3-country union.
Real quick, is the purpose of this to expand other countries? Meaning their expectation is there will be other countries that join this alliance, and joining the Sahel states, we will need a transnational capability of judicial overview.
Well, I think based on what they've said, I think the idea is that the doors are open, right?
Okay.
So they are not necessarily seeking to expand in an aggressive sense, but the neighbors are welcome to join in, provided that they sort of sing from the same crib sheet, provided that they understand what the purpose of the AES is, that the primary problem, political and economic, lies in the role that colonial institutions and, you know, so-called colonial masters continue to play in that region. So there have been overtures that have been made to countries like Guinea, for example. Guinea is to the west of the AES. Guinea used to have relatively close relations with the AES, but for whatever reason, the person who's in charge there, the president there, appears to be very, very closely French aligned. In fact, his wife is just very interesting bit of trivia here. His wife is a white Jewish French woman, a policewoman from France. Just very interesting bit of trivia there. So they're not really on board with each other like that anymore. However, similar overtures have been made to Togo, which is also a border state of the AES. It's also a coastal state. In fact, there was a period where Togo was effectively the de facto port of the AES. A lot of their international trade was happening through Togo. Nowadays, that has shifted more toward Ghana. Ghana is a lot friendlier nowadays, and obviously, Ghana has much bigger capacity to handle the size of cargoes that 3 countries will need. So, but basically, the idea is that the invitation is open, the doors are open. If you so decide that you are tired of existing under this colonial yoke, which is going to ensure that you remain poor and underdeveloped forever, then come join with us, right? Because if you rebel individually, you can be put down individually, which is what has happened before, right? But if you break out of your foreign domination, be that French, be that Portuguese, be that American, then this is how you maintain that newfound sovereignty. You come partner with us, and we can all share resources. We can all share intelligence. We can all share security resources. We can share. We can engage in group economics. We can do a bunch of things that makes life easier for each other. So that's basically what the goal is.
Explain something to me. What's the benefit of remaining under French, even indirect colonial yoke? Like, for example, when you point out either Togo or you point out another country that may be still closely associated with France, the one with the president with wife from France, for example, what's the motivation? I mean, is it just individual benefits that screw over the country? Because I don't get the sense that the countries are on board for it. They seem to be against this notion of any kind of even indirect colonial.
So the French-speaking countries in Africa have a very weird political situation. It's a situation where the vast majority of the population actually deeply resents French domination, and they can see it in a very visceral way. In some countries, like in Cote d'Ivoire, I don't know if that's the case now, but as I went last, I visited in 2021, you could actually see French soldiers on the streets doing stop and search operations on Ivorian personal vehicles and whatnot. I saw that with my two eyes, white soldiers doing that. So, and the sense I got is people were deeply, there was a deep sense of humiliation, a deep sense of rage, that we're supposed to be an independent country, and yet we clearly are not. So that sentiment in the public space definitely exists. However, the people who are the leaders or the heads of states are uniquely repressive. Even by African standards, they're uniquely repressive. And that repression doesn't just exist in a vacuum. That's a repression that is enabled and sometimes instigated at every level by the French government. So basically, if you're the head of states in a country like Togo, you're not the head of state because the people want you to be there. You're not the head of state because there's any real connection between you and the country that you're governing. You're there because you're the French colonial overseer. And the people realize that the minute they rebel against you, the minute they step out of line, the minute they decide to, flex their sovereignty in any meaningful way, you're going to send soldiers into the street to shoot them down. And if you don't have enough soldiers to do that, the French government is gonna fly in French gendarmes who are going to do the dirty job for you. This is not just me talking. This happened in Cote d'Ivoire. I believe it was in 2010. Was it 2012? 2010, when the former president, Laurent Gbagbo, who had supposedly just lost the election, was refusing to step aside for Alassane Ouattara, who is still the president now, 15 years later. And you had French commandos marching through the capital, Yamoussoukro, with tanks and everything. They went to the presidential palace. They shelled the presidential palace. They broke in. They physically manhandled this man. They tore the hair off his wife's head. There's a picture on the internet where you can see half of his wife's head bare after a French soldier just torn off the hair, and she's like half naked, right? So this is not hypothetical. This is a thing that happened. So even by African standards, the type of repression in these French-speaking countries is it's beyond the pale, right? So in Burkina Faso, for example, prior to the revolution, so the revolution happened in two phases. The first was in 2014, and then the one that brought in Ibrahim Traore in 2022. So what happened in 2014 was the person who had been president for 27 years, a guy called Blaise Compaoré, He was the guy. He was Thomas Sankara's good friend who betrayed him to the French and who basically assassinated Thomas Sankara. And he was in power up until 2014. And then he tried to extend his stay in power, and then there was like a protest, a riot thing in the streets, and he actually sent the military into the streets to shoot the people down. And then, for whatever reason, maybe people had just had enough, they didn't stand down, and then eventually the military made a tactical decision for the purpose of avoiding a civil war to ask him to excuse himself instead of going to war with the people.
Right.
And that was how Blaise Compaoré fled to Cote d'Ivoire, where he still remains. He's still in exile there. And then a military officer called Jean-Claude Damiba came into power, promising all sorts of things. Those things didn't happen. And then in 2022, when the people had had enough, then there was another popular uprising, and that's how Ibrahim Traoré came into power. So the point is, in the French-dominated parts of Africa, a revolution like what you just saw in Nepal, even though obviously we know that was a color revolution, but the way it happened, where it started off as people just protesting in the streets, and then the military stood down, and the protesters went on a rampage. That wouldn't happen in French-speaking West Africa. And the reason that wouldn't happen is because the military in those countries, first of all, the military is trained directly by the French military. This is a very interesting question you just asked, because it's going to lead to a segue. One of the interesting things that the AES did shortly after it came into existence was that it created the first officer training school in French-speaking West Africa. Because prior to the AES, if you wanted to become a commissioned officer in any of these French-speaking countries, you had to get your officer training done in France. There was no way for you to do it in your own space.
Oh, Lord.
So essentially, the military elite, which makes up a large part of the political elite in these countries, the military elite was essentially being indoctrinated in France. They're trained according to French military doctrine, according to French political doctrine. So, as I'm sure you also know, a large part of the France-Afrique project wasn't just physical domination for the purpose of extracting resources like with the British. With the French, it was a lot more insidious and a lot more cruel, because one of the things that the French made sure to do was to inculcate this idea in the minds of French-speaking people, not just in Africa, but around the world, wherever the French tried to colonize. I think the only place where this didn't succeed was in Vietnam. But in pretty much every other French colony in the world, the people there genuinely had this idea that they were French.
Interesting.
Right. So, so the French level 1 lives in France. And then you live in Mali, or you live in Cote d'Ivoire, or you live in Congo, you are French level 2. So your dream as someone living in a French level 2 place is to become excellent at something and become recognized, so that you will get on a plane and go to France level 1, right? So, and this was done in so many ways. The school certificate exams that are written, the best students, as a matter of routine, were always taken to France, right? So the countries had very little opportunity to retain the best of their own talent, right? So this was a systematic hoovering up of brains, of resources, everything that could be transformational in a country. So your best talent is taken to those countries. Some of these countries didn't, for example, have medical schools. So you wanted to become a doctor, you had to go to France and do your medical training there. Yeah. And then obviously you and I know there's a 50-50 chance that you may not come back.
Yeah, you may not come back. Especially if you're drinking cappuccinos in front of the Eiffel Tower, you're getting your croque monsieurs.
Exactly. Yeah. And once that happens, you are basically lost to your country, and you are lost. Your potential is lost. Your productive potential is lost to the place that it comes from. Right? So and this was done in so many ways. So the military was just another extension of this. So if you wanted to move up from being just a regular non-com to becoming a commissioned officer, you had to go to France. Right? Where you will get indoctrinated in the French military doctrine, and they will inculcate their own way of managing the French African empire into you. and put the idea into your head that the biggest compliment that you can have, the biggest honor you can have, is to oversee this French-speaking territory in partnership with France.
Wow.
So the AES, why the AES is so important to me and to so many people in the region, is that it is not just a repudiation of these very, very bad ideas, but it's a fundamental retooling of the African brain, the African mind that exists across these countries, because a lot of damage has been done to the psyche of these countries. So it's the first real attempt at sovereignty that has existed in these countries for hundreds of years. It's the first time that there's any real meaningful attempt at sovereignty, which is why some of us are so invested in the success of the Sahelian project. And to be fair to them, so far they appear to be ticking all of the boxes. And the exit from the ICC, in my opinion, is just one of the latest good moves that we'll see them making toward this end.
Wow. David, I swear, man, I learn something from you every day. Every time you come on. I will tell you one experience I had when I was in Kenya. My ex-wife and I, God, I don't know the years, it's before 2020. We get to Kenya. We love the place. People speak English, which makes it easy to kind of engage. And I remember having a conversation with a cab driver, and he points out, he says, my friend of mine works in the U.S. military. And I was like, get out of here. What do you mean your friend works in the military? He said, he has a uniform and all. He said, I could take you to the barracks. And I'm like, how on earth is your friend working in the military? He shows me a picture of his friend. And he's right. He's in a U.S. military uniform. And he says, what happens is that the U.S. military effectively pays Kenyan soldiers to go around the world and basically to commit military acts that the U.S. military doesn't want to necessarily do themselves.
Exactly. Such as Haiti.
Yes. But in this case, he was talking about other places as mercenaries. And pay them very well to do very horrible things across the globe. And if you have a country that's relatively poor and you had to feed your wife, you had to feed your kid,
you'll do it.
Take the money, you would go. Yeah. I did not know that at the time. I was shocked by that. But I guess this feeds into the whole Kenya-U.S. association thing. David, man, thank you for this. Like I said, I learn something new every time you come on. I really appreciate it. David Hundeyin. He is an investigative journalist, author, filmmaker, founder of West Africa Weekly, and 2023 James Carey Fellow at Cambridge University. By the way, David, is there anywhere else that the people can find you? I want to make sure I have it. Have everywhere.
You can find me on Twitter at David Hundeyin. That's my name. You can find me on Instagram, same handle. LinkedIn, I don't know why you don't find me on LinkedIn, but if you search my name, it's there.
Right. Does anybody really use LinkedIn? I don't know anybody who uses that, even though everybody has an account.
And then the platform that I founded is called West Africa Weekly. So that's westafricaweekly.com.
Okay. My man.
That's it.
Thank you for this. You be safe, okay? Have a good rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Yeah, you too.